Hi there, coming to you today from Green Bay as we talk about early medieval Christianity. I thought I'd bring this Pauline provocation to you from the sanctuary of our congregation, Union Congregational UCC in Green Bay. I'll give you a quick tour. It could be a medieval church. It's English Gothic style, built in 1930. As you can see, the typical Gothic structure, surrounded by the windows, each representing a particular virtue. Transepts on the side, it's shaped like a cross. Let me walk down and show you a bit more. Whoops. So you can see in that direction. And then the back of the church. Yeah, it's a sort of high church. UCC, I guess, would be how you would describe it and us. And it's just been a great place for me to be. So, Latin Christendom, part 2. Here it's a story, as McCulloch tells it, of Christians fighting Christians. By and large, Goths, who were Arian, versus the Latins, who were decidedly not, and the Byzantines, who could kind of go either way, depending on the whims of the emperor. But across the board, the rise of clergy and the rise of the bishops, the role of the bishops, was a consistent feature throughout. Clear rulers, clear rules, tidy-mindedness, and a emerging spread of ascetic spirituality from the monasteries out to the lay people. So that's basically the story we're going to be telling today. I found it interesting, and I'll be following along with the reading, starting with McCulloch. So page 324 highlights the near miss of Arian Christianity in the West. And I think this is a really fascinating point, perhaps a stronger point than his conclusion that Rome was not likely to be the center of a strong Christian presence. But the fact that the Goths were Arian, and it took one bishop to kind of turn Europe, Central Europe and Northern Europe in particular, towards Latin Christianity, and especially among the Merovingians, was a crucial contingency that has led then to the dominance of the Bishop of Rome. And so during these years, the chief story is really the rise of papal authority. Hormisdas, from Hormisdas all the way down to the affirmation of papal infallibility at Vatican Council I in 1870 is a pretty consistent red thread through this time period, or originating in this time period. And it was Gregory I, the servant of the servants of God, which McCulloch describes nicely as a very aggressive bit of self-deprecation. But it would be a mistake to only emphasize the aristocratic and centralizing character of Gregory. He also really gave rise to the notion that pastors, priests should be engaged in pastoral care, and including ministries among the poor. And also was a fine missionary, Pope sending the first missionaries off to Britannia, where there were Christians already, but bringing Rome in particular to Britannia. And so Gregory is ranked one of the 4 doctors of the church, along with Ambrose, Jerome, and Augustine. So those are the big 4 theologians of the church, doctors of the church. Of course, it would be fun to put together a corresponding 4 from among women And maybe somebody could, take that on as a little essay of some kind or another, maybe for this week. So in Britannia, the mission sent by Gregory find Celtic Christianity already, blending and assimilating so-called pagan elements into the faith. And it's interesting that one of those elements that is particularly emphasized in Ireland in particular is this penitential system, this practice of personal penance and austerity that, of course, resonated then with what was happening in Egyptian monasticism and monasticism as it developed throughout Europe during this time period. A couple key names to mention, of course, Iona, as one of the more enduring of these monastic settlements down to today, and Canterbury as well. Even though, of course, the real center of power for the Archbishop of Canterbury was always Lambeth Palace in London itself. But what's important to note again about all of this development in the far north of Europe, relatively speaking, is that what you see is an attempt to impose on all of these places, along with, of course, by now France and, more slowly, Germany and the Low Countries, the attempt to oppose Roman obedience, right? And yet at the same time, I think McCulloch, somewhat uncharacteristically, recognizes that there's more going on here than merely the preservation of empire and the assertion of force. This page 343 talks about, the rapid number of conversions and the spread of Christianity throughout Europe this time period. This is near the bottom of the page. Everyone wanted to be Roman. The memory of the empire stood for wealth, wine, central heating, and filing systems. And in two languages, Latin and Greek, could link Arba to Alexandria. But as King Oswy's judgment showed, that is one of these kings who helped establish through the missionary presence the conversion of a mass number of people. There was more to mission than simply material matters. People hungered for meaning. They were terrified of their own frailty. Over on page 344 then, an ellipsis, the troubled people of Europe sought not only good drains and elegant tableware, but a glimpse of the light which would make some sense of their own brief flights out of the darkness. The missionaries of Christianity talked to them of love and forgiveness, shaping the purposes of God. And there is no reason to believe that ordinary folk were too obtuse to perceive that this could be good news. All right, so again, somewhat uncharacteristically, something more than just tidy fighting systems going on in medieval Europe. Along with key figure of Gregory, the key figure of Charlemagne, also known as the Great, Charles the Great, 768 to 814 is when he was in power, if you want to situate him. Clearly established the Second Reich, if you want to think in those terms, with Rome being the first, the Roman Empire, and the Merovingian dynasty, and Charles the Great being the second. So he's dubbed the Holy Roman Emperor, anointed by no less than a pope, and setting up a tension then between political authority and ecclesiastical authority that would run throughout this time period, of course exploding under Luther. But again, Charles wasn't only about usurping the power of religion for his political agendas, he was also about copying manuscripts. And because of Charles preserving legacy, especially the Christian legacy, they didn't care so much about the heretical texts or many of the classical texts, which are unfortunately now lost to us. But after a 200-year hiatus, basically, of copying manuscripts, when we know that there was nobody really involved in doing this, Charlemagne revived it. So we have a great deal to a debt to pay to this otherwise ruthless ruler. Ruthless but pious, really emphasized the importance of the Mass, both high and low, and so you begin to see the emergence of side altars and churches and cathedrals all over Europe. Saw a lot of these in Italy, of course, and sometimes the side altars are in many ways more beautiful even than the main altar, depending on to whom that side altar is dedicated. And Charlemagne also emphasized and lifted up the importance of the Requiem Mass, and McCulloch devotes a couple nice pages to this as well. Pay attention to those. We're page 354, 55, something like that. I can't recall exactly. I didn't write that one down. My notes aren't the best. Again, it's important to highlight how Christianity was not only the system of power, but also from the ground up was helping people deal with fragility, with finitude, with the vicissitudes of, and contingencies of life. So all in all, the survival of European civilization, McCulloch writes on page 358, would have been inconceivable without monasteries and nunneries. So these concentrations and these intentional Christian communities that were founded during the Middle Ages clearly carried a thread from classical civilization down to today. Again, to them we owe a debt. Just a sidebar, the concentration of papal power produced its own corruption, and a figure such as John XII. Read the description of his exploits, now admittedly written by an anti-clerical historian, Edward Gibbon, but read it on page 360. Did you know that there was a rapist pope? All right. In part because of this corruption, but it wasn't like there wasn't corruption in the Byzantine Empire as well. The break between Rome and Byzantium became final and definitive in 1054, as we learned, which was really, and McCulloch's right about this, the culmination of a long alienation between these two Christian centers, with tragic consequences for ecumenism, for Christian witness on down to today. All right. So much for McCulloch. McGowan then about food and other liturgical matters makes the great point early in his essay, Christian Liturgical Tradition as Eating and Drinking at its Origin as Actual Food. Parallel to Roman banquets, classical banquets, McGowan's argument is that these banquets were the original Eucharist. Of course, the Passover meal is part of this as well. And the Passover, for anyone who has participated in one of these rituals, is a banquet. It is not merely a symbolic shred of bread and a small cup of wine. It's, in fact, multitudes of both. And then McGowan focuses the point even more, page 155, the process of attenuation or abbreviation of the meal into a food ritual was related to the emergence of the church as an imperial religion. So basically the trajectory that McGowan is tracing would have been helpful on your previous paper, perhaps, but learn it now, was the shift under the transformation of Christianity from a movement among the peasants into its imperial category, a shift in the basic ritual practices among early Christians, from their Jewish, festive, banquet-centered meals to this quasi-civic ritual focused on a very small portion of food. It's really worth reflecting on the significance of that shift and that context, namely that it was imperial Christianity which was associated with this civic ritual, with the bishop, the priest, managing the elements, and of course eventually reserving one of the elements, the wine, and serving communion in only one element with the blood, wine then reserved, which then comes out in some very interesting and strange ways in the relic veneration associated with various images, cloth, etc., that came into contact with the holy blood. So simply be aware that the struggle among some Christians to develop more robust Eucharistic liturgies focused around a real meal, whether it's at a dinner church or in some other context, has a pretty significant historical legacy. And this idea of reserving the host or the elements apart from everyday life is something very clearly associated with the emergence of basilicas, the development of bishops, the whole hierarchy and change in the power structure of the church down to today. Again, really worth reflecting on and thinking about. If you wonder why Christians aren't at the forefront of feeding the poor, it's because the Eucharist as an alternative meal with a spiritual meaning rather than a material feast, which it is obviously not, has taken the place of that more broader system of Christian care for one another that there are at least glimpses of in the book of Acts. All right, to the last chapter then, Bornstein, about relics and the emergence of especially female mystics and all kinds of practices of bodily mortification. Puts it nicely, Christian ambivalence about the body is something that wasn't found in either Greco-Roman or in Jewish traditions. In some ways, this ambivalence really characterizes at the heart Christian theology with the production of incredible beauty and a great historical legacy, but also some real pain and troubling implications. Bornstein doesn't do such a great job, I don't think, of showing how relics and the materializations of the divine through saints and the objects associated with them reflect a real hunger on the part of human beings for material contact, for that Byzantine, especially, unity of matter and spirit. Again, Byzantine's not so devoted, interestingly, to Neoplatonism and the dualism of body and spirit. And as a result, you have merging in Latin Christianity in particular, this real Christian ambivalence about the body, which manifests, of course, especially in the veneration of the martyrs, or the relics of the martyrs and the ascetics. Anthony the Egyptian, page 241, gives up property, gives up sex, gives up food, gives up sleep, and heads to the desert. Again, this is in part a protest against the emergence of imperial Christianity, but it also then embodies quite literally some of the powerful dynamics of empire in individual practice. The treasure of the flesh, the relics, and again, there's this hunger on the part of human beings for contact with the divine, and the desire to participate with relics, whether it's to touch them, to be in their presence, to see them, is much like what a tourist experiences today in going to some place where they want to relax, be in contact with, their spiritual oneness, whatever it happens to be. And that impulse for contact, communion with the holy is really what's behind relics, in my estimation. Don't get a whole lot of that from Bornstein, who's really pretty skeptical, and sometimes there are even some cheap shots in the chapter. But it's important to think through, because this hunger for material presence of the divine can really be exploited, and of course has been throughout the history of Christianity, and the Canterbury Tales, which Bornstein refers to as a great exemplification of this. Pilgrims on the way to Canterbury, telling stories to each other, and throughout it Chaucer is weaving his digs at the corruption of the church and the desire of the church to exploit this hunger for material, for real presence, put it, on the part of pilgrims. And yet, You know, the relics clearly had power. The stories of miracles in association with them are a way to communicate the kind of power that they had for people, healings, etc., very much in continuity with the power evident in the stories about Jesus' healings, including the one I'll be preaching on right here this Sunday. Example of Marjorie Kemp, another pilgrim along with Egeria. So if you wanted to, you know, follow or compare and contrast, take a look at her pilgrimage narrative. Again, Bornstein pretty skeptical about this, but accurately describes how, because of her piety, she was more pious than most of the pilgrims who were also tourists, and you know, were having a good time. Marjorie irritated them, and they wanted to try to leave her behind a couple times on her quest to the Holy Land. But nevertheless, this sort of poignant longing to be in the presence of the divine through the places, through the relics, is a crucial thread throughout the Middle Ages that, again, carries on down to today. I'm still reading your papers on Byzantium. Many of you wrote about the emergence of pilgrimage during this time period, and some of you wrote about it somewhat skeptically, I think I could say would be the case, contrasting pilgrims with tourists. And I have a much more fluid understanding of how those two things operate. Victor and Edith Turner, the great anthropologist of pilgrimage, put it this way: a pilgrim is half tourist if a tourist is half pilgrim. And I think that it's a continuum we're talking about here. It would be wise for parish pastors especially to pay attention to this hunger for real presence, for material contact with the divine. Evident among pilgrims intentionally, and among tourists often sort of accidentally or coincidentally, less integrated perhaps. All right, so the Word made flesh. Marjorie Kemp, of course, one of these pilgrims. The Word made flesh. Bornstein points out 8 different churches had Jesus' foreskin, which, you know, okay, that's good to know, I guess. But Bornstein makes the point that the Pope was okay with this proliferation of pilgrim sites, in part because it was profitable to the local parishes, but also because this holding on to the presence of the spiritual and the material in a unity was better than Cathar dualism. And, you know, go back to McCulloch and take a look at what he says about the Cathari. We may not get to it until next week, actually, so hang in there. But another one of these heretical groups, sort of like the Montanists that really emphasize this dualism of body and soul, or like the Gnostics, so-called, as well, who often saw the body as a prison. And so the veneration of relics is sort of an indirect way of critiquing that and of holding on to the incarnation. The rise of the veneration of the Holy Blood during this time period is particularly important, and one of these troubling trends as well because of the blood libel associated with Jews. Bornstein puts it well: Christians need to exercise their own lingering doubts about the doctrine of transubstantiation. How does this bread really become body, and this blood or this wine become blood, you know? And of course, this exploded in debate during the Reformation. So Christians had doubts about this, and Bornstein documents this, but they then projected those doubts onto a despised other, namely the Jews, with tragic consequences that, of course, produced a long legacy of Christian anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages, including, of course, on the part of Luther, with tragic consequences that, resulted in the Shoah. You know, the quote from Luther in his final essay, Von dem Juden ihren Lügen, on the Jews and their lies, as a horrifying witness to the fallibility of our ancestors and to this particular strain in particular. Be careful about that tendency to locate the divine or identify the divine in a material place. It's called idolatry, and it's been a temptation for people throughout time. But finally, living saints, the testimony of the flesh, holy women going to ascetic extremes. Check out page 260 and following. Maria of Venice, mortifying her sensuality, again with troubling consequences down to today in terms of economic inequality in relationship to women's work. and the ongoing patriarchal subordination of women in many Christian traditions. And yet you see arise out of that a lay culture of penance with lay people imitating monks, trying to out-mortify the mortifiers, or at least take on some of these practices as a public demonstration of piety. Well, that gives you probably more than you needed to write about Christian pastors and priests' tendency to like tidy filing systems. But I look forward to your responses and to your bigger papers. I expect to have some time to get to them next week, and look forward also to being on campus in Philadelphia for anybody who's located there. I'm coming into town on the 8th, and we'll be around then for 6 or 7 days, and then we'll be making a return trip in December as well. So if you'd like to get in touch with me for a face-to-face meeting, I know that that's a possibility during those time periods. If you're in Philly, I'll also be in Gettysburg briefly for a couple days, the 13th and part of the 14th. So if you happen to be located there, that would be a possibility to meet some then as well. All right. I get to go to a wedding reception now. We had a wedding here this afternoon. It was beautiful. So now the party. Thank you, and peace.